Welcome to the very first Soundcastle Book Club. I'm so excited. This is our first session delving into a tome. They're not all tomes, but today Hannah has chosen the tome and she is going to be the guide for this session. And I'm going to be listening and bringing my experience in. And this is how we hope it will unfold over the next couple of weeks. So even if you've never heard of this text, you don't know what it is, that's absolutely fine. You can be with us through this process. Get a cup of tea and enjoy while we dig deep. Hannah, it's your turn.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gail. So, just a reminder, Gail and I we're two of the co-founders of Soundcastle. We're very much practitioners, and we love understanding what it is we do and why we do it, which is why we've set up this book club. We're very aware, as I said before in an earlier video, that we are a real mixed bunch here in the community. Some of you might feel like you're a really experienced researcher. Some of you might feel terrified of the idea of academic language, and that is all fine and all welcome. The idea here is we start recognizing and celebrating our differences, realizing that each of us can bring something really different, whether it's a real kind of fresh new perspective as a brand new practitioner, or whether it's someone who's got seasoned, lots of years of experience. All is welcome, all is valued. And the idea behind this book club is we'll delve into these amazing pieces of research that are out there for all of us to access, but maybe don't always feel like they're a part of our world. And we're going to be connecting them to our world, to our practice, and turning the theory into real life, basically. Good. So, without further ado, the book we are looking at today is Community Music in Theory and in Practice. We thought we would just go straight to the nub of it in today's session. And this is by Lee Higgins. And Lee Higgins is the director of the International Centre of Community Music, which is based at York St John's University, a great place doing great things. You guys should all go and check it out. And he's written this fantastic work, which is just full of amazing theory and practical examples that back up exactly what it is we do. But before we delve into that, I thought, Gail, it might be really useful for everyone to hear a little bit about your background and your relationship with research, just so they can understand the angle that you're coming from today.
So I think, how do I use research? Like, research for me is always inspiration, or sometimes it helps me clarify what I'm seeing. When I get really excited is when I read research and I think I can see how that works, or when I'm like, this is something completely new. I've never looked around this problem in that way. So I do a lot of work with families at the moment, and also in mental health as well, actually. And in both cases, there's things like the way we grow and the way our minds work, and the way people might learn, or understanding neurodiversity, where understanding bits of research have just helped me frame what I'm doing, or make choices about how I might do what I want to do, or also just be interesting just to consider it from a different perspective. Sometimes really great research is like another voice in the room, and you're like, were you there? Did you see what was going on? But it just looks at it from another perspective. I think it's good. It sort of shakes out my practice and reminds me not to get too set in my ways as well, I think.
Wonderful. I really resonate with that as well. I find that when a new piece of research comes out, it just makes me think, okay, how can I challenge myself now? Or how can I be evolving and responding to this evolving, changeable world that we're in as well, because every generation is completely different to the next.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes in music, maybe as a performing art that can get quite fixed, it's also easy to feel like the workshop should get fixed, or like the approach can get fixed. And I think that's not how we work, but it's very easy to settle into that. So I think sometimes research can come out. It just gives you another way to check what you're doing, or look around what's going on, or if things aren't quite working, are there other aspects you haven't thought of to look at.
Such a good point. And I think that actually quite nicely leads us straight into an area of the book that I wanted to look at. This idea we have of, sometimes wanting to fix things, or things that should be done in a certain way. And so I might just dive straight in if that's all right. And
yeah, great.
Let's go for the first bit. So we're looking at chapter 9, which is approaches to practice. And Higgins writes, from the perspective of the community musician, facilitation is understood as a process that enables participants' creative energy to flow, develop, and grow through pathways specific to individuals and the groups in which they are working. Facilitation does not mean that the community musician surrenders responsibility for music leadership, only that the control is relinquished. And I think that really ties back to what you were saying before, Gail, because it's this idea, as soon as we want to fix something or aim towards a fixed product, that sense of control is starting to infiltrate our work. And I would love to discuss with you now, like, in your practice, can you talk about the difference between control and music leadership, as Higgins writes here, and what does that actually look like in reality?
It makes me think about working with families and parents, and how often it feels like people are asking sort of to be controlled. They want, if they're not feeling very confident about being musical, you want to be given the music. But what we know is that we learn best and we build our creativity by finding it within ourselves and exploring. So being the music leader or the facilitator is sort of about holding the musical space and encouraging people to explore themselves. So I can give you like chords on an instrument, but I could also show you how the chord works, and you could make the strumming pattern, or we could have a keyboard and you could choose the notes that we use to make a melody, but I could say that we're making a melody if you feel like we need that direction. And what we find, so Beacons is about families coming together to write music. So that's children from usually 0 to 10-ish, and parents all writing together.
And the Soundcastle project that you work on, Musical Beacon.
Yeah. And in that space, in a way, we need lots of different kinds of support and control, and to bring something together. But it's not about being like, you play this note, you play this note, you play this note. It's more about so we want to sing something together. How can we co-create a melody? Like, how much choice can you hand over? If a keyboard, for example, is completely overwhelming, which it might be, sometimes it is, it can be like, well, let's find 3 notes that we really like and work with them. So then I'm taking that control as a leader, but equally I'm not saying, and then if your elbow accidentally knocks a 5th note, like, great, let's take that experiment and go off and find out does that give us a funny beat? I've done lots with kids, like, where we're running our hands up and down keyboards because you want to play every single note, but does that give us a pulse that comes into the rest of the music, so that we are growing the music with the people that we're part of, but equally we have an eye on just holding it. Does that make sense? I don't know if I've kind of got there.
Totally. You said 2 things there that I thought were really interesting. You mentioned this idea of choice, and this idea of how we give choice in our workshops to help people explore their own musical pathway. And so I see that as music leadership. If you were controlling, it would be like, play this note now. But equally, if you give someone a whole keyboard and they feel really overwhelmed by that, and you say, play any notes you want, that might be not enough leadership for them. So your example of giving these 3 notes, you've given and you choose which note you play and when. You've set like a musical framework that has choice within it. I think that's a really nice example. And the other thing that you made me think of, especially in working in early years context, and this idea of running fingers up and down keyboards and all of that, is it's almost like this idea of messy play with sound, right? And we often have to let go as music facilitators in terms of what we think it should sound like. We have to let go of this idea of should and think about, okay, well, what sound world might this person want to explore? And how can I set up a framework for them to explore that sound world?
Because I think a lot of music leadership in these kind of groups and in early years is like, so like silence becomes it becomes a very difficult thing to get, but also like that listening space to make these so that we can hear the sounds that are going on. It doesn't become just a big crazy sound, you know, lots of instruments are playing, but that music in those spaces, I think it's like structuring the silence so that we can work out with the sounds and really hear what's going on more than being like, I mean, it's crazy, get a 2-year-old and be like, you play this at this time. I mean, who wants to have that conversation? And what's funny is we have those conversations also with the parents who are like, oh, my son is now 4, but you know, we've been through it where I'm like, wow, yeah, 2-year-olds don't want to sit down, and that's fine. And like moving about in a session with older kids is totally great. So it's also holding the space that a 2-year-old can have their intention and explore what they need to do, and like an adult who does want to be told to play this note at this time, that makes them feel safe. Like, how can you get those two things go together? I think in there is like the facilitation, like the art of balancing those two needs at the same time.
Yes, beautiful. It's like you're anticipating what Higgins is going to talk about, because actually that totally brings on to the next point that I thought could be really useful to discuss. And he's really kind of talking about this idea of flexibility as facilitators, exactly what you were just saying, of how do you cater to this person of this ability and this person of that ability, or, you know, how do you change your approach from person to person, from minute to minute within a session. Personally, this is one of my biggest challenges. And Higgins writes, facilitators are never static in one approach or another, but move in and out of roles as the group dictates. Facilitation necessitates trust in the ability of others, as well as submission to the inventiveness of others. Community musicians develop this trust as they learn to listen to others while maintaining the skill to enable the participants to work together and steer a course for their group. I would love to hear your experiences of this, of kind of listening to the group and responding, and having to be flexible in your approach in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what we're always striving for. And when I hear that, I'm like, this is like the kind of big aim, and it's never perfectly like this, which I think is really important to say. It's never smooth, but that's sort of part of the joy of it, I guess. I think when you're trying to like mediate between all these different people, it's also part of finding listening space. I think it definitely goes back to listening and working out how individuals can speak in a space. Like, I know that we've talked a little bit, like in mental health, for example, like if you sit, especially lots of adults in a circle, how it creates a void in the middle. And so speaking into that is very challenging, or can be very challenging. Or if you're a very small person in a room full of big people, if it's families, like speaking out can become very, very complex. So you might all be writing one song, but like it's just that question, like how can every voice have an opinion about this that isn't necessarily everybody speaking in the same way? It might not be spoken, it might be about moving. There's definitely something about improvisation, about nurturing a group that will improvise, that can improvise.
Sometimes without ever using the word improvisation, so no one knows we're actually improvising. We're playing, we're experimenting, we're exploring. It's amazing how I find when I'm facilitating, even the language that I use can have such an immediate triggering effect on people if I'm not careful. And so it's almost like when you, especially that first session with a community where you're this guest walking in, hopefully there will have been maybe some co-production beforehand, so you might not be complete strangers to each other, but you are a guest in this community. And I often find in that first session, I'm doing so much working out of what this community wants from me and needs from me. And sometimes they are like ready to go and full of ideas, and it's really clear to me that I can just be holding the conversations and facilitating and just making space for different people to speak. But other times I feel that there's a fear in the room and a real desire for very clear music leadership and quite structured activities at the start, just for people to feel held and cared for, and okay, now I understand what's going on, and then they're able to open up a bit more. But it's like every community has a completely different journey based on.
And most recently, I think to be very present, like thinking about all the times you've been on Zoom recently and what that means for, as a facilitator, trying to accommodate, like, different people definitely cope with this box in different ways. Yeah, let me out. And for some, there have been people for whom it's worked really well. I've had some kids who find it incredibly helpful to just like focus what's going on, and then they've been able to ask questions and be more articulate. And for others, like Zoom and kids is very, very complicated. I think we can't just take it for granted they want to do it. And the same with the adults. It's been really interesting. Like for some people, it seems actually quite a comfortable space they can really focus in, and for others, like, we're missing this like physical reading of the room, which I, as a facilitator, find it's like relearning what you've just described, like, or learning what's possible and having to just like ask more for feedback and ask more from my co-facilitators for more feedback and things. I don't know how you found it.
I couldn't agree more. Like, I've spoken a lot about this with various colleagues, that I think if we're not careful, we all have Zoom faces, and lots of our community members on projects have Zoom faces, and it's either I'm really struggling with this technology kind of Zoom face, or it's I'm watching TV, or it's kind of like, or it's like I'm watching the bird fly past the window, or there's no eye contact. It's impossible to have eye contact on Zoom. And so you find yourself looking around different parts of the screen, zooming in on different things, literally. And as you try to get a sense of the people you're working with, because you can't make eye contact and the online body language is so different, it's so much harder to be truly responsive, because all those natural human cues we're used to getting aren't really there. And so I've definitely taken the approach of being really upfront about this with everyone I work with on Zoom now, to the point where I've been like, how can I create warm-ups that shake out our Zoom faces? All the warm-ups are so different because we're not in a room together, we're not physically moving around each other. So how can I create a way for us to play with these little boxes, these screens, gallery view, speaker view, just to engage us and wake us up? And I think often it's just that thing of reminding the group that we can see all of you, we're here. And like you said, sometimes we just have to be really direct with, can you give me some feedback on this? Because we're not getting it from those instinctive cues we would usually have. Yeah. So,
for me also, it links in fact what we were talking before about like control and leadership, and like it's like a whole new space of control and leadership, because I can like mute the whole mute button, and like how I view it if I'm in my different views on the screen. And like for some people, like just getting to a project, a community space to get into a session is that's their work. And now it feels like it's a different work, like in your personal space you now need to set yourself up to do these calls. And I think as a facilitator, it's interesting how the ground shifts, and being able to shift with it is really difficult, but really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting. And you've handily brought us on to the third and final point I wanted us to look at, because Higgins starts to explore this idea of a safe space and what actually is a safe space, and how can we be creating that as leaders. And he talks about this idea of welcome, the way we establish a workshop or a session and bringing people into the room. And he says, through the welcome, the facilitator can create a pathway toward a genuine invention, an authentic and meaningful adventure. As a strategy, facilitation is employed in order to evoke this imaginative and inventive atmosphere, encouraging and nurturing a rapport with fellow human beings. This action requires that the working space be a safe space in which the music facilitator attempts to create an atmosphere that is mindful of the participants' range of abilities, but challenging enough to stimulate all concerned. In this way, the community musician creates deterritorialized spaces in order to open opportunities for the workshop event to become a place of conversation, negotiating, and play. And it all comes down to this idea of how do we set up that safe space? What does that look like in reality? And can you tell us a bit about your experience of creating safe spaces?
It makes immediately we think about beacons that we used to run in a centre in Bow, and for a while it really had this beautiful bit where we would open this session half an hour before the music making would start, so that like kids and families could come straight in from school. I was thinking about the welcome in that, and that we would set up a space that had like the usual like tea and refreshments and fruit and drawing and like some cushions, and there was a bit of outdoor space, and it was actually really important. Like the families that really flourished in that space were able to come in, almost like claim it for themselves. It was interesting supporting facilitators in that space because they're slightly on the back foot. Like they're not, they've been hired as leaders, facilitators, but in this half an hour they're just having tea and chatting. So you just got to be a person in the room and help people arrive. And I think that was so important. And yeah, to have that space. And then we would have a start for the session where we would adapt. We'd suddenly take everything out, or like move the colouring tables, move the pens, get everyone to come together. I think it was really important that the family somehow claimed that's like literally the space, that they'd moved into it, they'd been in it for a while, they'd settled into it, so that we could start from somewhere to then make the music making. And then we borrowed from sort of early years practice to have like a recipe song and a hello song, which you would have in early years, but actually we adapted it. So the recipe would be about like the values that you have in the session, which again I guess is relevant to this. So we were using Makaton, like we're here to make music, and all the things that we do, like we think and we listen and we help and we're careful with all the stuff. And it was just this kind of rap song and about being together that we would do every time as a ritual, that then it was so held. And interestingly, a lot of this came, just thinking about book club, through reading and understanding more about autism and how we could make this space more predictable, given that it's an unpredictable music making space. That we wanted to welcome all kinds of neurodiverse young people and adults into this space. But by making these frameworks that were quite fixed, there would be a big circle time, small groups, and come together. That and then allowed us all to be more brave in what we were creating, and to do like tests, making some ideas, and then have a bigger space to make ideas. So it really became about the structures that made the space safe, while not going back to our very first point about controlling every single sound that was made. And so we would have like a timetable on the wall. So it was, but we never knew what music we were going to make in it.
Beautiful. So yeah, there's a couple of things I wanted to pick out of that. I love that you use the word ritual. I think that's really important. And this idea that the community members were part of that ritual. You're having tea and snacks at the beginning, you have a drawing corner, music playing in the background, this idea that you're setting up the space together. It's not like they've walked in and now music making will happen. We're creating an atmosphere together. And then you've got your hello song and your recipe song. So what I'm hearing is the sense of ritual, but also in the structure, there's like this framework that you've established within which very free music making can take place. So everyone knows, okay, these things are going to happen, and for the neurodiverse people attending, they can feel reassured that they're being held within this framework. There's some element of predictability, but at the same time, there's room for creativity. That's really special. And it's almost like there's two frameworks. There's the framework of how you're physically setting up the space, And then there's the framework of how you're facilitating that space as well, in terms of the structure of the activities.
Yeah, and how we all inhabit the space. I think ideally, well, in Beacons it's quite a big team of facilitators as well, so it's like it's a lot of people. Once it's families, it's like there's many people in that, and then there's a team as well. And when he's talking about like whose territory is it, I think it's really important that there is an idea that like it might be someone's territory, or we're stepping into somewhere. Again, which is interesting with Zoom, because it's sort of like whose territory are we on, because we're all in our houses, which is just something we're reconsidering what that means at the moment.
Speaking of Zoom with it, I've got an interesting example from People's Music Collective, which is a mental health project that we both work on. And I remember when we were thinking, oh, we're going to have to move it all online because of COVID-19. How do we do that safely? And in terms of creating the safe space online, I was going to, oh, what if someone Zoom bombs the session? How do we make sure no one's recording it and everyone, you know, not feeling under surveillance kind of thing, and all of this kind of stuff. That's where my head went in terms of safe space. Then when we got into the session, I realized how much more deeply I needed to think about this, because ideas weren't flowing as easily as they had done when we were in the room. And when I stopped to think about it, I realized if you're on gallery view on Zoom and there's 16 people in this group, you have 16 faces just staring at you. It's confrontational. It's like you're on a spotlight with 16 faces staring at you. And they're not just looking at you, they're Zoom faces. So they're like, I mean, who feels safe enough to give a creative idea with that? So we've had to do so much work with the group in terms of how do we encourage each other in that space and retain what we used to have as a group in an online setting. But also, and we were talking about this the other day, and this connects back to control again, the group requested to be making a series of tracks to build their first EP, which is really exciting. But also, because we moved online, we started losing some of those team games we'd been playing and the more playful, improvised aspect of what we'd been doing. And we're focusing far more on generating material for the tracks. And later on, we started to notice that members of the group, their levels of self-criticism had really grown, and their fear of failure had grown. Whereas before, we'd got to a really nice place where people weren't worried about making mistakes. They felt safe to make mistakes. And we realized that we were focusing too much on this controlled outcome of we will make a finished song, rather than let's explore together, let's play together, let's make mistakes together, let's make sounds that sound really wacky and weird together so that we can free up that creative flow. And I think the next challenge for us on the next term of this project, which will be online again, is how do we go back to that original feeling of playfulness we once had? How can we be designing online activities and warm-ups that generate that feeling of playfulness and remove that fear of making mistakes?
I think it totally comes in. Normally I would sort of find a project by like, what do we sound like who are we all together and what do we sound like? And that doesn't exist on Zoom in the same way, unless everyone generates the sound, sends it in, and we compile it. So I think, just the whole idea of community starts to move and shift, and the space that we come into. And like, we haven't yet got like a Beacons online recipe, but I can see it happening, which may be very similar to what we have in the room, but it's also, like, what is that recipe that brings us all onto Zoom as musicians into this strange boxy space, to make sound together? Like, there's still something that we need to, like, so to the core of like humans, to make sound together, and yet we're in this format that doesn't really allow that particularly well, but it's so important that we get together. So there's so many things that I guess that in that facilitation, like, how can I start to feel like I'm being musical with you, even though the time difference, the lag, the video is not quite the same. There's a lot that's possible, I think, actually. But it does feel like learning a whole new skill in a whole new space.
Absolutely. And I feel like this could be a really useful question to round up the book club on today. And maybe we can put that out there to people who are commenting or watching, have you been working in an online space yet, doing community music? And if so, what's been your approach to maintaining a safe space? Has there been that one really useful activity that you're like, yes, I got this? Or do you have questions that you'd like to put out there to the group to ask for support on? It's a really kind of formative, interesting time, this online Zoom way of working, and I think there's a lot that different members of the community could be learning from each other.
Can I add an extra bit to that? It was also like, in those experiences and what's working, how, because I find as a facilitator, the feedback is just a lot less unless I really demand it. So I'd love to know like how it makes other facilitators feel, or how they've dealt with that, or if they've developed ways of, maybe it's linked with that, with like, how do we gauge what's actually happening when we're leading and facilitating on Zoom, and how do we manage that feeling of being at a distance ourselves as a well-being thought?
Great question. Brilliant. Yes, so please everyone discuss, take the conversation forward. Gail, thank you so much for exploring that in such depth with me. It was wonderful to talk with you.
Always a pleasure.
And you will be hosting the next book club, I believe.
Yes, I will be hosting the next one. I haven't decided what it will be yet, but watch the space. We'll be back for more excited talks about facilitation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at the next book club for more conversations. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.